this opportunity to share some recent research that that I've been involved in. And I was trying to figure out how to begin, and I thought that I would begin actually by sharing the words of Trevor Specht. He's an IT developer at a company called Mapbox, which is in the US tech industry. Mapbox is a tech company which produces online maps. And 2 years ago, around 150 out of 222 workers at that company signed union cards with the continent's largest union for communication sector workers, the Communication Workers of America, which has been very active in organizing tech workers. And these words are important. He says, we see ourselves as part of a larger movement. It's bigger than just Mapbox. Things are really moving in organizing the tech industry. And we're a part of that. Now, unfortunately, the union drive at Mapbox was unsuccessful. The company brought in, oh, we have one person with their hand up. No. Okay. The company brought in a union busting law firm, and they disciplined some of the workers who were organizing a union there. In the end, I think what appears to have happened is that the workers on that union drive were intimidated out of their vote, and they ended up losing their vote. But I think the words are important nonetheless, because there is something really important that's happening in the tech sector, and I'm looking forward to talking about that with you today. So today I'm going to draw on some research that I have been doing in a collective research project, a collaborative research project with Greg Deputer and Nicole Cohen. Greg Deputer is at Wilfrid Laurier University, and Nicole Cohen is at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And the name of that research project is Cultural Workers Organize. And what we have been aiming to do now for well over a decade, we launched this project in about 2010, is to track examples of conflict and collective organization in the so-called creative industries. So our focus is on creative labor, as the title of today's lecture is, although we tend to use the terms cultural work and cultural workers. We can talk about that a little bit later. So what I'd like to do in the next 45 minutes, well, half an hour to 45 minutes, is to offer a little historical context for the research project, and then discuss some examples of labor conflict and collective organization happening in the tech sector, mainly in the North American tech sector. I will admit that that's the geographic scope is that. But I'm also very interested to hear what's happening in your part of the world. And so hopefully in our discussions, we can touch upon the prevalence of the tech sector and the tech work. So this is going back a fair bit, but towards the end of the 1990s, as many of you will know, the term creative industries was very popular, both in policy discourse, in academic discourse, and in wider kind of discussions around work. And the creative industries was, as it was originally imagined, brought together sectors like the arts and culture and media, advertising, games, and crucially, the high-tech sector as well. And the creative class discourse became very popular through the work of people like Richard Florida, who suggested that economies and cities should be designed for arts and culture, for entertainment, for media, for sports, and for the tech sector. And he discussed, him and many others discussed the jobs in these sectors as, quote, creative class positions. And he had a famous book that came out in the early 2000s about what he called then the creative class. And this idea has run into problems over the years. He was quite widely critiqued for a range of different problems in the work. But the idea of creativity being central to communication and cultural industries has remained prevalent. Arguably, certainly in the Western world, national governments have been still very keen to pursue economic development policies and economic growth policies that are based on the idea of communication and culture and information technology. And you know, we can probably see the current purchase of this idea by the fact that, you know, now you know, the label of online content creators, right? It's still a kind of an echo of this creative class idea. And I should say that, you know, the idea was, you know, it makes sense how this policy discourse would have been appealing over the years. I mean, the idea that capitalist economies were leaving behind the bad, dirty, dangerous industrial work and moving toward an economy where people produced culture, information, technology, and knowledge, and also had very rewarding jobs, right? This was one of the key ideas of creative industries discourse, was that you know, for the first time in a very long time, that a significant portion of the population was actually doing work that was very rewarding, right? So this is the slide that I chose, you know, do what you love, forget the rest. This was a kind of, it's an ethos which is characteristic of creative industries kinds of positions. And I would say that, you know, creative labor as a term has some significant problems. I think that, you know, if you're looking at it strictly, you know, any type of labor creates something, right? And so the moniker creative has its challenges. And more importantly, the work that Florida and others was doing really tended to ignore a lot of the problems in this kind of work, in these kinds of work. So work in the creative and cultural industries was intensely precarious. There's a lot of unpaid work. There are a lot of severe inequities along the lines of gender and race, et cetera. And of course, you know, the ability for, you know, the graphic designer who is based in New York to do their work relies on, you know, the extraction of coltan in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the assembly of electronics in the Pearl River Delta, et cetera. So there's a much broader and global economy which supports the creative industries and which often isn't discussed. And so in the work with that I have done with Greg and Nicole, we are looking at what we see as a process of class formation that is happening in those industries. And we're driven by an approach which prioritizes the study of worker resistance and collective organization in the arts. So among workers at digital media outlets, workers in the film industry, and others. And there's a lot of activity. And I mean, I was just meeting with Greg and Nicole a couple of weeks ago in Toronto. And it is remarkable, since we began the project, the degree to which there has been a real upswing in labor organizing in communication and cultural industries among artists, among unpaid interns, certainly workers at digital media outlets. There's been a wave of organizing at places like Vice and others. And so one of the areas that I want to talk to you about today, which is a particular area of interest for me, is labor organizing in the tech industry, in the high-tech sector. And I have a long history of looking at labor organizing in high tech. It has always seemed to me that as a sector, high tech is incredibly important, and it is driving really, really significant and major social changes in our world. And if we want to mitigate those changes, and if we want to push back against some of the changes that the tech sector is producing, that one of the more likely sources of that change is going to be the workforce in tech. And so for my doctoral research way back in the early 2000s, I looked at an emergent union called WashTech, the Washington Alliance of Technology Workers, also supported by the Communication Workers of America. And they were organizing what they called permatemps at Microsoft. These were workers who worked in many cases at Microsoft's campus in Redmond, Washington, but they were not employees of Microsoft. So they were what is called temps, vendors, or contractors, or TVCs. And they were employed by a third-party organization, so a contractor. And often these workers worked side by side with Microsoft workers. They had different colored badges, and they were not, for example, invited to company events. So if Microsoft had a big party for its employees, these workers weren't able to go because they weren't officially Microsoft employees. And they were excluded from things like pensions and benefits and all of the things that Microsoft workers got. So this was one of the case studies that I looked at in my doctoral research. And this was important because, it was a full 1/3 of Microsoft's workforce. So Microsoft had 60,000 people working at its Redmond, Washington campus, and about 20,000 of them were TVCs, or permatemps. So what happened back then was there was a class action lawsuit that was brought against Microsoft by these workers. Microsoft was forced to settle this lawsuit. And the settlement, we don't know what it is, but it was millions and millions of dollars that Microsoft was forced to give back to these permatemps, because many of them had been working at Microsoft for 10 or 12 years, right? And not been employed by Microsoft. And this is going to be kind of crucial for where I'm going next. At any rate, back in the day, it was my hope that this was going to be the beginning of a labor movement in tech. And unfortunately, that did not come to pass. So what happened was that after the class action lawsuit was settled, I think a lot of workers thought that they had gotten what they deserved. And so they became less militant. And the second thing that happened is that Microsoft started offshoring a lot of its work to India. And WashTech it moved on from the idea of organizing permatemps it began organizing around the idea of offshoring. And unfortunately, the rhetoric of the organization became quite problematic, and potentially even a little bit racist, in the sense that they were trying to get American workers upset about the fact that work was being offshored, as opposed to seeing workers in India in much as colleagues, right, as people that they should be organizing with. So WashTec ended up not really going anywhere, not being a successful example. So almost 20 years later now, fast forward 20 years into the future, and the situation has changed, I think, almost completely. So there has been, as you will know, global controversy around the activities of the tech sector. There has been discussion of the threats that these activities, that the tech sector poses for democratic governance, for market competition, for media independence, for urban livability, consumer privacy, and others. And this push has come from many directions, and it's significant because, again, I think that the tech sector is very much at the cutting edge of global capitalism. It is one of global capitalism's most strategically positioned industries and crucial industries, one that all other industries are increasingly relying on, and one which is transforming other industries in many cases in kind of problematic ways. At any rate, one part of this backlash against tech, which is often, it's referred to in North America as the techlash, a kind of a broad pushing back against the activities of this industry. One part of that techlash is what I and others had actually been hoping for back in the early 2000s, something that a scholar, labor scholar, Ben Tarnoff over here refers to. He says has referred to it as a tech labor movement in the making. And this movement is broad, it's sustained, and it is manifesting at many parts of, again, what I think is the most important sector in American and indeed global capitalism. And I think there are many reasons why this, what we could call a cycle of struggle in tech, is emerging. But I think that one of the more significant reasons is the rise of a defining technological and social form of 21st century digital capitalism, which is the platform. So I'm sure you all well know this, but I just want to be clear about what I mean here. And I'm referring to the way that I understand a platform is as a proprietary digital infrastructure that mediates between one or more groups, users, customers, advertisers, vendors, and of course, workers, right? That's a key group of people that is affected by the emergence of this technological form. And I think that the foundations of an economy that has been dominated by platforms was set in the 2000s. Platform companies are characterized by a range of really distinctive features, distinctive economic features. So free services cross-subsidized by other branches of the business, a pursuit of network effects, the crucial role of data as a commodity, and the growing adoption of algorithms or artificial intelligence, of course, and we can talk about all of this. And some of the workers that I will be discussing later are actually training the artificial intelligence for some of these platforms. And the last thing that I want to mention about these companies is that they have in their DNA a particular set of values and discourses. And this includes the celebration of flexibility, critiques of authority, which is interesting, comes from maybe its Californian countercultural roots, a worship of individualism, entrepreneurialism, creativity, again, and speed. I see that somebody has their hand up. Maybe that's unintentional.
Professor, there might be some problem sharing the screen. Like the slide is fixed and it's not changing. So that's why I'm informing about that.
The slide is fixed?
Did you change the slide or it is just stuck to the first one, Enda?
Oh, I have been changing the slide. Yeah.
Oh, okay. We have been seeing just the Amazon, Google, and Facebook logo.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so but I will be moving through the next. Here, I'll move it on to the next slide for you. Okay. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that platform companies have been certainly our mainstream press has been very keen to has been very celebratory of platform companies and of the their positive effects for the economy. But I think one of the more interesting questions that political economists have confronted recently is whether platform capitalism, as Nick Chernick has referred to it, represents a qualitatively new variant of capitalism, and whether we are entering a different kind of capitalism, which is which operates according to different logics. And this is now an old slide because it's marked by, it's the top 10 companies in February 2021, which was a long time ago. But if you look at the top 10 companies now, there's not a whole lot of difference. There are a lot of those same companies in the top 10, right? And you know, obviously we should take these numbers for a grain with a grain of salt, but the market value of their company is I think an important indicator of the strategic importance of this sector. And of course, these are in many cases platforms and platform-based companies, or even companies that operate according to platform logics. So what I want to talk to you about today is an upswing in labor organizing in the North American tech sector. And what I'm going to focus on most closely, is the organizing that has been happening at Google, or Alphabet, as its parent company is called, and Google's contractors. Okay, so this is an important reason why I mentioned the earlier Microsoft example, because it tells us a lot and it predicted a lot about contemporary labor organizing in tech. So Google has been a really important site of labor organizing in the North American tech sector, but that labor organizing has also included companies like Amazon, Kickstarter, Apple, and a number of others. And a really important note here, of course, was that the Alphabet Workers Union was launched in 2021 on the heels of really significant independent organizing by workers at that company. And the Alphabet Workers Union is a project that is supported by the Communication Workers of America. This is a large union that is based in the United States and also in Canada. And a part of the research that I do collaborates with the Alphabet Workers Union in order to develop knowledge that can be valuable and of use to the Alphabet Workers Union in their organizing of the tech sector. And we'll discuss this a little bit more as well. And another thing that I wanted to mention that is important about the Alphabet Workers Union is that it has adopted what is called a wall-to-wall organizing model in the tech sector. And this is important because what it means is that the Alphabet Workers Union is not only organizing directly employed Google workers, but it is also organizing the contractor workforce as well. And again, I'll talk about this a little bit more soon. But for example, very quickly, I can say that it has led to Google Fiber contractors in Kansas City voting to unionize with the AWU, bringing retail workers into the union. So these are Google Fiber sells, basically, they're like an internet service provider in some places, and they have a storefront. And in Kansas City, one of their stores unionized, again, with the Alphabet Workers Union. And more recently, a group of YouTube music contractors also voted to unionize. And just 3 days ago, a group of YouTube content workers who work for the YouTube, support the YouTube searches, have also voted to unionize with Accenture. So there is an emergent labor movement that's happening, and some early successes, and I think it's important. You know, I've been talking with organizers at the Alphabet Workers Union, and the way that they describe it is they say, you know, the phone is ringing off the hook, right? We can't actually get to all of the calls that we're getting from workers. That's how much interest there is. They can't keep up. They are I think they're hiring something like 15 or 16 new organizers just to be able to keep up with all of the interest that they're getting from tech workers. So this will give you a sense of just how widespread the dissatisfaction among tech workers is. So what I want to talk about today, however, is one specific case, which I think is exemplary in some cases of the organizing that's happening at Google and beyond. And these are, it's the case of Pittsburgh Tech Workers United. This is a group of contractors for the tech company HCL Technology, which some of you may know. And they unionized with the United Steelworkers in 2019. And their case is really important because they were one of the very first group of tech workers in North America to unionize. Okay, it has happened at other places, but this is important because they were some of the very first. These are workers who make about $40,000 US a year, roughly, which for tech workers is not a lot compared to the kind of money that people who are directly employed by Google would be making. And what they do is they optimize artificial intelligence for shopping online. So a lot of them are highly educated. They have degrees in linguistics, university degrees, and they do this work optimizing artificial intelligence because, as one of them says, quote, somebody's got to teach the machine, right? Right. So that gives you a sense of what they do, and I think it's especially important to pay attention to the kind of work that these people do, because we hear a lot about artificial intelligence being magical, right? It has these kinds of magical properties, and it's almost as if there's no human labor required. But of course, there's always human labor required to train the artificial intelligence to label the data. And of course, a lot of that work happens in the developing world, of course, and has significant parallels. But I want to use the case of Pittsburgh Tech Workers United to make a couple of points in the discussion, okay? The first is that the understanding this case is important because it creates very serious problems for the idea that tech workers are a kind of a labor aristocracy that enjoys relative surplus wages, right? That's actually a quote from a political economy of communication scholar who, it's a widely repeated idea that tech workers are apolitical, that they are a labor aristocracy. Yes, they're wage labor, but they make so much money that they're apolitical and in fact conservative often, right? And I think that this has been a really damaging idea. It's been a really damaging idea for tech workers as well, right? And I think instead, what I would say is I would stress the words of an organizer who led the union drive at HCL. And he told us that for tech workers, he said, the party's over. And his estimation, what he believes, is that the labor conditions of outsourced tech workers are actually that they give us a view of the kinds of employment conditions that tech platforms actually prefer and are working towards achieving. So even for the more privileged tech workers at companies like Google, the writing may well be on the wall. Okay, so that's a kind of a key idea. And also, I think ultimately, if you've been paying attention to the layoffs in the tech sector that have been happening, or to what has been happening at Twitter after its takeover, I think it really brings home the idea that the tech sector is not a kind of a magical sector where there are good labor relations and where people do what they love, but rather it's a capitalist sector like any other sector, right? And we're beginning to see that, especially when there is labor organizing. So when there's labor organizing, then the real face of the tech sector comes out, okay? And the second related point that I want to make today is that contracting out is a key axis which unites organizing efforts by workers at Google with those at other tech companies. So and I think that the strategy of the Alphabet Workers Union is very promising in this regard, although it faces significant challenges, and we can talk about some of the challenges after, if you would like. So in the time that remains, what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about contracting out, the process of contracting out in tech. And then I'll talk about the organizing at HCL. And then I'll wrap up by discussing our collaborative work with the AWU. So contracting out is a really long-standing process in Silicon Valley labor arrangements. So in the early 1990s, Silicon Valley hired migrant Latin American and Asian workers to do work in food service, in cleaning, and circuit board assembly. I mentioned the example at Microsoft at the end of the 1990s, but certainly it is a part of the DNA of the tech sector to contract out as much as possible. And by one estimate, contingent labor, or techs, vendors, or contractors, actually accounts for about 40 to 50% of the workforce in tech. So about 40 to 50% of the workforce is working for one company, but actually being employed by a different company. Okay, and again, this is very important. And why does this happen? Well, if you ask executives at a company like Google why they contract out, that they will say that it gives them access to talent that they don't have in-house, that it enables them to adjust very quickly to new market opportunities so they can scale up or scale down as needed so that they can be nimble. But I think that, you know, as a political economist of communication who's adopting a critical and anti-capitalist critique, I think it's very clear that at the end of the day, outsourcing in tech is about corporate profitability, and it's about workforce control. Those are the kind of the defining logics. So the defining logic there is outsourcing by keeping workers off the books, right? So you keep workers off the books, you cut your costs, and along the way, for companies like Google and others, you get added bonuses. So you get to delegate managerial discipline, so you don't have to deal with disciplining those workers yourself. The other company will discipline them for you. And you can also inflate your productivity stats, right? This is very key for Google for platform companies, because investors care deeply about the amount of profit that you are making compared to the workforce that you have, right? So keeping track of your productivity is a very important metric. As one labor researcher said, quote, "The fewer employees you have, the more productive you look on paper," right? So that is a kind of another key reason why this happens. And in fact, the rise of contracting out isn't something that Richard Florida really ever would have talked about very much, because it didn't fit his story of how work was changing in the so-called creative economy. But contracting out has become so essential to high-tech's labor management strategy that it has actually created a sizable subsector of global outsourcing firms, each of them with yearly sales in the billions of dollars US. Okay, so this is a very large sector of the economy, right? That we don't actually hear about very much. I refer to it as a low-wage, high-flexibility mirror image of the established platform companies. And one of the kind of more humorous things that we have found in our research is that, of course, the Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, which is often referred to as FANG, and if you speak to contractors in high tech, they will refer to which, right? And bringing together Wipro, Infosys, TCS, and Cognizant. And HCL, which is a very different group of companies, one that we never really hear about, but they were established in the early wave, the first wave of knowledge outsourcing, and they mostly emerged on the Indian subcontinent. And what they do is they supply a cheap and flexible global labor force of 1.75 million workers. So just among those companies, there's getting close to 2 million workers on their books. Just to give a sense of the size of the labor force there. And it's possible, due to your location, that you actually know much more about this subsector of the global tech sector than we do. But one of the things that is quite striking as we're trying to find out more about companies like Wipro, Infosys, TCS, Cognizant, et cetera, is that they appear to kind of be invisible. Like they are the polar opposite of Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix. Everyone is always talking about these companies, the first companies, and they love to be talked about, right? So Apple, Netflix, Google, they love press and coverage and media attention. With which companies, I think it's very different. They live almost in the shadows, and intentionally so. There's a goal of, even the business press doesn't cover them as much, which seems surprising given that, you know, this is a sector of the workforce, which, as I say, it almost, even just those 5 companies employ nearly 2 million people. But I think that there are many other companies that kind of do exactly the same thing as those companies. So I think it's important, and I would value any insights into either political economic work that has been done, or even just business press that has been given to these companies, which now operate globally, right? I mean, they initially made their money by providing a workforce in India, right? That's my understanding. But they have since opened offices all across the world, right? So now they have an office in Pittsburgh, which we're going to talk about. HCL has an office in Pittsburgh, which we're going to talk about very soon. So that's kind of an overview of the sector, and I'd be keen to talk about that a little bit as well. Now, contracting out, certainly it took off at Google in the 2010s. So the first wave of contractors at Google, what they were doing is they were scanning books for Google Books. And this is a workforce that was a kind of a secret hidden workforce on the Google campus. They worked in their own building. They had different colored badges, again. They were mostly racialized people. They were men and women of color, recent immigrants. And they went to work scanning all of the books that end up on Google Books, right? Again, you go to Google Books and it looks like, you know, you look up a book and it seems like there's no labor there, right? But they were actually the labor. You know, this was the kind of the hidden abode of production in Google, where they were doing this scanning work. And incidentally, if you've never seen it, there's a beautiful and really short documentary here called Workers Leaving the Googleplex, and this picture is taken from there. Which is available online, and you'll be able to see it, which I would highly recommend. And it was made by the artist Andrew Norman Wilson, who was employed by Google until he was fired because he started filming people leaving this secret building, and then turned it into a documentary. So, and another book that I would suggest another chapter that I would suggest is one by Andrea Zafiro, who writes about these workers as a kind of invisible labor force. And one of the things that she writes about, which is quite striking, is the fact that sometimes in some books that you find on Google Books, you can actually see people's fingers, because they were actually scanning the page, right? And so again, it's like this, almost like a ghostly reminder of the kind of labor that has to go into the information society, which these companies really don't want us to know exists, right? They don't want us to know that this labor is the labor that is necessary for platform capitalism, right? And platform capitalism cannot exist without platform labor, right? No matter how many stories we hear about AI. At any rate, by about 2015, temps were hiring temps at Google. So they were getting temporary employees they were getting them to hire others. And today, Google has a quote, what the New York Times called a shadow workforce of about 150,000 people So there are now more temps working for Google than actually Google employees, right? So again, another really important stat. So if you looked at Google's actual workforce, it would probably be around 250 to 300,000, but most of those workers are actually contracted out to other companies. All right. So one of Google's key clients is HCL, founded in 1976, very early. Hindustan Computers Limited rose to prominence in the 1990s during the first wave of offshored work to India. It now operates in 50 different countries, over 50 countries. It has over $11 billion US in sales. And it has over 200,000 employees across the world. And the CEO, Madar Malhotra, has described what they do as supercharging solutions for people and the planet. But our interviewees, the people who the workers that we interviewed who were working for HCL in Pittsburgh, they saw things a little bit differently. And one of them said, because we asked them to describe HCL, and one of them said, not a real company. They fancy themselves as a real company, but their entire business is outsourcing. It's kind of like they're going through all the motions of being a company, but there's nothing behind it. There's no substance. So this kind of talk was really common among the contractors that we've spoken to, and it highlights the direct link between the union drive that happened in Pittsburgh and the widespread bitterness which drove them to form their union. Now, the union drive was organized around what we would call bread and butter issues, so pay, wages, the amount of vacation that workers had, or the flexibility to work from home, which is an emergent issue for tech workers and others. Pay was extremely low. Salaries were arbitrary. Raises often came in at under 1% per year. And almost every single worker that we spoke to reported being either lied to or misled about salary and raises at the time of hiring. So many of these workers were hired on, they were told that they were making a certain amount, and then several months later, they would look at their pay and notice that they were actually making less than they had been promised during their job interviews. And then there was an interesting dynamic between contractors and the quote unquote true Google workers, right? Because they're working together all the time, right? And in fact, sometimes they're working, in fact, pre-pandemic, they were working together at Google's Bakery Square office in downtown Pittsburgh, which is shown in the slide. And with the contractors, again, having nowhere near the same amount of privilege that, or privileges that the Google workers had. And the contractors that we spoke to spoke about the frustrations of working with Google workers and sometimes feeling like the permanently employed, directly employed Google workers treated them badly or ruled over them and kind of acted as their supervisors, even though they were their colleagues. So I think I mentioned that this union drive was historic, which it is. But despite being historic, I think in many ways it was quite ordinary. I mean, it unfolded in many of the ways in which union drives unfold, certainly in North American settings. And here I would plug a book by my colleagues Greg Deputer and Nicole Cohen, who it's called Digital Media Unions. And they looked at the organizing process at digital media outlets like Vice and others that has been happening over the last 4 or 5 years. And the process is very similar to what we saw, what they found in those works. So HCL workers, they approached the Steelworkers Union. They were assigned a staff organizer from the steelworkers. They formed an organizing committee. Before going public with the campaign, they prioritized face-to-face conversations. They tracked their progress on Google products like Google Sheets and Google Docs. And their employers' inattention allowed them eventually to build support for a union vote that they won. And we asked the organizer, who said, well, why do you think you were successful? And one of the things that they said was, they said the company HCL was so disorganized. It was, one of them referred to them as, quote, and pardon for the swearing, they called it a multinational shit show, suggesting that it was a completely disorganized company, and that for that reason, they didn't realize that there was a union drive happening until it was too late. However, once they did realize that there was a union drive happening at the company, they pulled out all of the moves that tech companies have been doing now once they realize that there's a union. So they called captive meetings. So they had meetings with all of their employees in which they tell them about how bad a union is going to be for them and threaten them. They prevented organizers from distributing materials. They brought in a name brand union buster, Eric Vanetti, who I'll show you right here. He's a very famous lawyer in the United States. Companies pay him a lot of money when there's a union drive at their company. And they also offshored work from Pittsburgh to Poland, to their offices in Krakow, Poland. Partly as retaliation, right? So there was a kind of there's a not so subtle message in there that we can move your work around whenever we want, okay? Unfortunately for HCL, that move itself, retaliating against a labor organizing drive is actually illegal in the United States, and that would lead to the union. So a notable kind of thing about this labor organizing was the support that HCL workers got from their colleagues at Google, their in-house colleagues at Google. So Google colleagues in Pittsburgh attended meetings. Google workers in California and Silicon Valley sent over a cake to celebrate, to support their colleagues in their working. And the organizers that we interviewed felt that they got this support from Google, from in-house Google employees, because they were realizing that the mistreatment of HCL workers could become a reality for them too, right? So again, to read you that quote, the longer one, the party's going to end here for you. It's ending already. Otherwise, HCL wouldn't even be here doing jobs that should be done by Google employees. And I think that a lot of the supportive folks at Google saw that and understood that, right? And it was also important for people at HCL who were maybe a little bit hesitant in terms of wondering whether they should be supportive about the organizing or not. And to get the support from actual Google employees made a big difference for them, apparently. So I'll end off on a happier note. In the summer of 2021, over 18 months after winning their vote, the HCL union, they're now the United Steelworkers Local 4040. They finally ratified their contract with a resounding yes. And their new contract includes significant raises, flexibility to work from home, and more guaranteed vacation than they had before. And this was after over a year of their employer basically refusing to bargain and dragging their heels when it came to bargaining. And in the end, because HCL had essentially broken the law in transferring work to Poland, the steelworkers went to the Labor Relations Board, and that forced HCL back to the table and to agree with this historic contract, this historic first contract. All right. I will just really quickly end off because I feel like I've spoken a lot here. But I just want to end off by talking about some of the ways in which our project has been collaborating with the Alphabet Workers Union. And some of the work that we have been doing is been trying to better understand these contractors and to find out more about them to aid the organizing. So these are, as you can see, cognizant workers who are based in Texas. They're in Austin, Texas. They just voted 41-0 to unionize. And part of what our research project did was to do a company profile of Cognizant so that AWU organizers could have a better understanding of what this company is, where its locations are, et cetera. And another thing that we have done is the Alphabet Workers Union did a survey of temps, vendors, and contractors, a really historic survey in which they used Google's own internal messaging system to survey the contractor workforce. And we have worked with them to develop, to facilitate the visualization of that data. And that data revealed not only that TVCs were making a lot less than in-house employees, but that also there are severe inequities among temps, vendors, and contractors, which are exacerbated by things like race, gender, sexual orientation, and ability. So contractors, perhaps not surprisingly, contractors of color make less than others. Women contractors make less than men, and that is repeated by sexual orientation and ability. And so I'm gonna end the presentation there. I hope that this has been of interest and to you, and I look forward to whatever questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Enda. The talk you gave today, I believe it's a crucial one, and I believe it should be thought-provoking to the students who attended this. And I was scrolling through some random questions they have, which they had sent me personally, but okay. I'm not sure like how much they are relating to your discussion today, but I believe that they have some relevance to the course that they are taking. So okay. One of them is asking, like, as you said, that even for, okay, there are some students who are also sending direct questions. So yeah, we can take them first. So do you want me to read it aloud so that everyone can?
Sure, yeah, that would be sure. Great, yeah.
So one of our students, his name is Mukarram Hussain Talukdar. He wrote that, do tech union movements have any impact on mainstream American politics? Will union movements in America encourage more outsourcing of tech work to the global South?
Yeah, really, really good questions. I think that the movements of tech workers have a limited effect on US politics. And even now where, at least in terms of presidentially, they have a very favorable, they have a relatively favorable figure in the White House at this point. There have been important discussions that have happened in terms of the fact that often companies in tech have where there have been issues such as like sexual misconduct or sexual harassment, companies in tech have imposed binding arbitration, have imposed and secret arbitration, right? So, which has meant that as an employee, if you go through the process, you're then never allowed to speak about it afterward. And in some states, certainly in California and in others, there have movements of tech workers have pushed back against that and achieved some changes. And in particular, one of the things that is being tested in US labor law is what's called joint employer status. And so that idea, which I didn't get to talk about, but the Alphabet Workers Union has been pushing very hard at this, is they have argued in the case of Cognizant that Alphabet is a joint employer. So Alphabet, when they bargain with Cognizant, Alphabet needs to be at the table, and the labor board has sided with them. So this creates an interesting. I'm not sure in practice what the implications will be, but I think symbolically it's very important to force Google to the table and to force them, to put them in a position where it's clear they have to admit that they are at least partially the employer of these workers. And to answer the second question, I think that's a really, really important question. And I think that, as the example with HCL suggests, these companies are global and they can move work around very, very easily. I don't think that should stop workers in North America trying to organize. But what I do think is that we need to think, and this is kind of going back to the work of Alam and I's mentor. I think we need a labor movement which is one of transnational solidarity. I think we need to look at the labor forces of these companies, which are across dozens and dozens of countries. And we need to build a labor movement which is transnational in order to counteract the possibility that these companies have to move work back and forth.
Mukarram, I believe that you have got your answer from Professor Brophy. So yeah, the other students that I was talking about, like a remotely relevant question that she is asking about, that you just mentioned that even though AI is at work, you also need labor to command them. But there are some possibilities that is saying that, for example, in the very near future, music can totally be created by AIs. And the recent layoff incident that happened in Google. So she wants you to briefly talk about your views on that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I don't have a crystal ball, and so I don't know where the future is going. But it does seem to me that, at least at the present, the forms of AI that we are seeing that are already making an impact in the economy. So ChatGPT is a really good example. Those forms of AI need human beings to label the data. I mean, even ChatGPT has needed workers in work that incidentally that's been offshored to Kenya and other places, where workers have to ensure that ChatGPT doesn't give answers that are racist, sexist, dangerous, or just give really bad advice, right? I mean, and so the quality assurance and the quality control is still human at this point. So that's one thing that I would suggest, which is important. And you know, we shall see how the technology changes in the future. But I'm a little bit more convinced by the argument that a new emergent technology will displace some forms of labor, but it will create the necessity for other forms of labor. And so that's something that I would say. The other thing that I would say, of course, is that ChatGPT, it trains on these and other similar technologies. They train on very large language models, which are, you know, essentially vast amounts of data. And I think we need to see that data as labor. So ChatGPT takes all of that data, which is the labor that we have collectively produced over years, right? I mean, and in fact, there's a form of theft that's happening there, right? Because a lot of these companies that are generating technology like this, they don't tell us where they got their data, right? And so again, it looks like the AI is operating without humans, and yet it's trained on the cultural output and the activity and the modes of speech and the modes of interaction and the knowledge that human beings have accumulated and put online, right? And so again, ChatGPT and other forms of technology are derived from human labor, right? And so I think it's important to make that connection. Partly again because these companies present them as a kind of magic or sorcery, but I don't, they're not really magic at all. It's you know, they're magic like any commodity is magic, right? I mean, any commodity, you get it and you don't understand the context of its production, it appears to be magic and mystical. And the same is true with AI. If you know, the closer you look, the more you find people who are doing data annotation in Kenya and other places in the world. And indeed, these workers here that I was talking about in Pittsburgh.
Okay, one of our students has added a comment to that. I don't think that's a question. He's saying that it's Alamin Rakib Tonoy. He's an alumni. So he wrote that not just the music sector, some video editing software came up with AI, which are capable of editing videos based on sound and silence on the sound of the very video, and it's improving day by day. Yeah, that's for sure. And I have a small question in relation to this particular question, that you said that eventually even though they are replacing a lot of physical work that we used to do, but they are also producing work. But are those new forms of works paid or unpaid? For example, in journalism these days, previously it was just the print media, but now we have shifted to the digital formats. So now they have to keep account of the views, like the international view, the local view, total view. So these are all the extra jobs that they're doing under the same paycheck these days. So any comment on that, Enda?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it, you know, where possible, capitalism is always happy to take advantage of unpaid forms of work. Wherever it can enjoy unpaid forms of work, it will take advantage of them. And the example that you propose as far as digital journalism is an important one. One that I would give is the reCAPTCHA images. So some of you will know that in order to verify whether you're a human or not, when you've signed in or signing into a website, sometimes it'll say things like, pick out every lamppost, or pick out every picture of a car among the 9. What you're essentially doing there is you're training AI, right? And so you are unpaid, right? I mean, you're doing unpaid work there. This is a company that essentially has a business model which relies on unwaged work and so it extracts, yes, very, very small amounts of unpaid work, but it's one example of the ways in which these companies are happy. They are more than happy to take advantage of unpaid work. And again, I would say the very large language models that these companies are training on, that should be seen as unwaged work, right? All of that information and culture and knowledge that we have generated over the years that these companies are scraping to train their AIs, that should be seen as a collective fruit of our labor for which we are not being remunerated, right? And I think it's very important to look at it that way, to think of it that way.
Okay, my mute? No, yeah. So one of my esteemed colleagues who has joined the session, he has a question. It is from Saeed Shahjad Al Karim. And he wants to ask you that intellectual property rights and creative labor, how is it protected when creating creative things using AI? Is there any discussion about it in academia? I think there is, yeah, but Enda.
Yeah, so I mean, here I would take what is happening right now among writers for film and television production. So as you may know, there's a strike that is happening in North America where the Writers Guild, workers for those shows, and including things like Apple Television and Netflix and others, are on strike. And so here in Vancouver, Gopal, you will remember we have a big film industry, right? And so they shoot a lot of movies here, and so all of my friends who work in film they're not working right now because there's no production happening because the writers are on strike. A key aspect of that strike, one which makes it a really, really important thing to pay attention to, is that the writers are demanding language around the use of artificial intelligence. And so they are committing, they are asking the studios to ensure that the studios commit to a certain set of practices around using AI and around not using AI. And so it makes it very, very, in terms of intellectual property, that's not really my area. But in terms of the study of the relationship between capital and labor in those industries, AI is really, really at the heart of labor issues and is going to continue to be. And this first example of writers, I think, is very important in the sense that it gives us a sense of the kinds of labor conflicts that are going to come and the role that AI plays in them. So again, I don't want to suggest that AI isn't important or that it isn't a game changer, but I think we need to pay attention to the way that it is being deployed by companies and the ways in which workers are responding to it.
Yeah. I think, does anyone have any other questions to throw towards Enda? Dear students and esteemed colleagues, do you have any more questions for Enda? I think they're pretty content. Yeah.
All right. Well, I very much appreciate you joining me at this late hour over there. It was wonderful to be able to share my research, and I thank you so much for organizing this talk. It was excellent to see you, and who knows, possibly one day I can come and visit.
Sure thing. We would love to have you in here, Enda. And thank you for sharing your future works with us. Can't wait to read the book. And for everyone else, like Enda's first book, it won a number of accolades, actually. It was, at least I know of 2 of the very renowned awards that is given for the books. So all the best for all the activism you carry with yourself as a scholar. And that is really something that I look up to and everyone of my generation look up to. Thank you very much, Enda.
Thank you for your very, very kind words, Gopa. I appreciate it. And nice to meet everyone.
Yes. So good night. Oh, sorry.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah.